In our lives, but particularly now during this corona pandemic, many of us experience loss. Loss of loved ones, loss of jobs, loss of finances, loss of freedom, and perhaps even loss of hope. Loss is just as much a reality in the lives of believers as it is of unbelievers. But the question is, how should we respond to loss? Let's take a look. In the context of a world that is subject to decay and the challenges that the Apostle Paul faced, he writes, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." I believe the Book of Ruth is a wonderful testimony of the truth of the scripture. If you haven't read the story recently, I encourage you to pause this video and quickly read it. It's only 4 chapters long. The story begins with great loss, an example of what Paul means with "in all things." Naomi has lost her husband and her 2 sons, and her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, have become widows after only 10 years of marriage. As the story unfolds, we see how Naomi and Ruth respond to their loss. Naomi goes back home to Bethlehem feeling abandoned and rejected, and allows her circumstances to define her and even her image of God. Ruth, however, doesn't go back to her mother's home, but chooses to devote her life to Naomi and to her God, the God of Israel. Now, although Naomi went home empty, as she puts it, she failed to realize that God was already at work in her life and had provided her with Ruth, who would prove to be better than 7 sons. As Ruth takes the initiative to find food and work, she happens to stumble across the very property of Naomi's husband's kinsman redeemer, Boaz. He is a relative of Naomi's deceased husband, who would be entitled to take over Elimelech's property and family, but there is another kinsman redeemer who is a closer relative who has the first rights. As it turns out, this man is unwilling to take over Elimelech's property and family, and so Boaz purchases Naomi's property and marries Ruth. It is a wonderful testimony of how God redeems these women and works for their good. But we must also recognize that, as Paul puts it, God works for the good of those who love him. Ruth's decision to devote her life to Naomi and to Naomi's God and people is a revelation of what it means to love God unconditionally. This love is not just an emotional response to God's goodness, but a decision to devote one's life to God in all things. The story ends with a genealogy that shows how Ruth was to become the great-grandmother of King David and one of the 5 significant women mentioned in Matthew's genealogy that leads to the birth of our kinsman redeemer, Jesus. The conclusion of the Book of Ruth is a testimony that God fulfills his purpose for those who love him and are called by him. For we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. As you reflect on the Book of Ruth and Romans 8:28, let me ask you, are you allowing your circumstances to define you, or even how you view God? Are you going back home and returning to what you know, or are you stepping forward into God's purpose for your life by faith? Do you believe that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose? Are you convinced, as Paul writes in Romans 8:38? Ruth devoted her life to Naomi and to her God. How does your life reveal that you love God and his people unconditionally? Who is the Ruth in your life that you need to appreciate and realize they are better than 7 sons? I encourage you to read and meditate on the Book of Ruth, as well as Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 39. I also want to encourage you to memorize Romans 8:28, which will remind you how you can respond to loss, knowing that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Don't allow loss to define you or how you see God, but ask the Lord to show you the Ruth in your life to help you step into His purpose for you as you devote yourself to Him, His people, and His purposes. God bless you.